everyone. My name's Emma McIntyre and I'm from 7digital. At 7digital, I'm head of music partnerships. Sorry, it's a bit windy here, so just nod if you can't hear me at any point. But yeah, at 7digital, what I generally do on a day-to-day basis is help our clients obtain the relevant licensing to launch their new music services. So I think just in terms of today, what we are going to do is, I want it to be more of a practical guide rather than a sort of in-depth licensing 101. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about the current rights landscape. We'll also talk about the basic sort of copyright law. We'll talk a little bit about collective licensing, and then we'll move on to a much more practical guide and put it all in context and give you some tips for what to think about when you're trying to license your music service. I'll also be around, just as another note, I'll also be around this evening at the Meet the Speaker session. So if there's anything you want to talk to me about one-on-one, just give me a shout. More than happy to do that. So let's just start here with the rights landscape. Currently, there is absolutely no way of denying it. The rights landscape is very complex. There's hundreds and hundreds of buzzwords that you'll hear out there, such as communication to the public, public performance, works, sound recordings, mechanical rights, all of these terms that are really important, but what do they really all mean? There's also hundreds, if not thousands, of rights organizations. So you may have Warner Music, Warner Chappell, CZAC, ASCAP, PRS, PPL, just the list goes on and on. So who do you need to speak to when you want to license your music service? So let's just start with looking at the basics of copyright law. So copyright law sets out two basic rights that we need to ensure are covered when we're licensing a music service. So you've got your sound recording, which is the right in your recording. So it's the recording industry. What we think about there are things like, so it's your performers, your artists, and your labels. You've also got your works, and that's your publishing industry, and that covers things like your lyrics and your composition or your score. Generally, we sort of talk about your songwriters and your composers and your publishers. When I'm dealing with new services and even services that have been in music before, I tend to just generalize. I don't go for these flashy sort of terms, and I just call it basic publishing and label agreements. It's just easier. That's how my brain works. So let's just move on. That's the basics. Let's just move on and talk a little bit about collective licensing. So what is collective licensing? Many rights holders make a decision that they want to put their rights over into an organization who will manage the negotiations on their behalf. In general terms, this is meant to simplify licensing, and in some instances it does. The issue is it doesn't offer all of the functionality that we would potentially want when particularly the new business models coming through. It covers things like broadcast and TV and radio, jukeboxes, but I think most importantly in the context of today is that it does cover some digital. On the recording side, it covers things like a linear radio stream, so a non-interactive. It also covers your more sort of semi-interactive or customized webcasting, as it's called in the UK, and that's where you have functionality like limited skips forward. It doesn't go into the full on-demand or some of the newer business models that we see. Just before moving on from this, one point I want to highlight is just the mechanical right. Again, it's one of these terms, but what does it really mean? Again, I'll generalize, and basically it's just the right to copy or to make a reproduction. So when you stream, in effect, you are making a copy or a reproduction, and that right's got to be covered. In the UK, it's not such of an issue. Generally, you'll find mechanical rights covered in your PRS agreement. But if you move towards territories in the US, for example, it's not covered under the agreement that you would get, and you need to work with an organisation such as HFA or MRI in order to administer those rights for you. So let's just move on. That's a very whistle-stop tour of the licensing landscape, but let's just try and put it all in context and see what it really means on a day-to-day basis. So you've had your big idea, you've done all your brainstorming, you've done your research, you've got your funding, and you're ready to launch a service. For the context of today, we'll just say that it's a $3.99 subscription product. It has limited functionality, but you're going to make it available in the UK only. So by limited functionality, I mean it's very much playlist driven and not that full search capabilities that you get with Spotify. So to start off, what you really need to do is ask yourself some key questions, and I'm just going to face round this way slightly. So firstly, the first question you need to ask yourself is, who is going to manage the licensing process? Are you confident enough to do this yourself? Do you know the rights landscape well enough to manage it yourself? Or do you potentially want to reach out to a lawyer and work with a lawyer to do this, which can be expensive? Or do you want to employ a consultant? Or perhaps you can use someone like 7digital that have framework agreements in place with all the major right holders, and you can leverage those deals, and it just speeds up the entry to market for you. The next question sounds a bit random, but it's, can you actually describe your music service? And it's amazing how many people that we meet that can't. And by that, I mean, everyone can talk about the idea, but the actual, the functionality and how is content going to be consumed? Are you going to allow for caching, the offline playback? How is it going to be paid for? So is a subscriber going to pay every month? Or do you want to bundle with a device, say speakers or headphones? Or, is that how you're going to pay for your subscription? There's also a huge question around content here as well. So how much content do you really need? Do you need full 60 million tracks, or are you going to offer a more niche service and perhaps focus on one genre, maybe rock or EDM or something like that? And that can have a significant impact on the cost of your licensing as well. So the next on the list that you should think about is your territories. And very often we meet, people who want to launch, and we'll ask them, what territories do you want to launch in? And they will say, every country. But you've got to be prepared to pay. If you want to launch in every country, you've got to be prepared that you will have to pay for every country, whether or not you've had any users there. So I would say tread carefully, be realistic, maybe start off with 2, 3, test and learn, and then move on to more territories. The next sort of question that you need to think about is, who do you actually need to reach out to, and who do you need to speak to? And this is where your decisions come around whether you're going to license directly, or are you with the majors and the publishers, or are you going to go the collective licensing route? And let's just say for ease, and the example I gave, that we are going to go collective licensing. In effect, what that means is that you have 2 licenses to obtain. Although you won't have full content, full repertoire, it will give you enough to launch your service in the UK. But let's say you decide you want to launch in France and Germany as well as the UK. Suddenly this opens things up massively. And you'd be looking in the region of maybe 15 plus licenses that you need to secure. On the publishing side, you would need at least 7. And then you would take your 3 majors, possibly another license for Maryland to get you the majority of the the indies. And then you'd probably want a couple of the key, the main aggregators as well. So it's quite a lot of work and a lot of expense as well. The next question is, what are the key terms that you're likely to get? And this is really where your industry knowledge comes into play, and your contacts. You can go out and ask. Really? Wow, 2 minutes apparently. So so you've really got to I'm rushing now. You've really got to think about things like what terms like advances, minimum guarantees are a huge thing that you need to think about. I'm just going to skip on because this is actually the main one. So here's really the practical steps that you need to take in order to license your service. So make sure you've booked meetings with all of the right people. Make sure you've gone into the rights holders at the right level and secure those meetings as soon as you can. The biggest point here that you need to think about is your projections and your financials. This is really, really fundamental because it'll be the basis of the potential MGs that are proposed to you. So you've got to get this right. Don't try to go in and say, I'm going to have 1 million subscribers in the first month. You'll have to pay for that. So maybe don't downplay it too much. You've got to keep them interested, but be realistic and be open and honest about it. Then you've got to put together a pitch where you go out and you really do a roadshow that really sells your proposition, what your value is and how you're going to support the music industry and what value can your proposition bring. Also, then, once that roadshow's finished, you start to look at your proposal. That's where you put together the terms that you want to obtain and you start your negotiation there. That's where the back and forth happens. Once the term sheet, you've all agreed your term sheet, it moves on to a long form. Hopefully at that stage you have agreed preferential terms that you're really happy with, and you can then launch your service. Sorry, that was a bit quick at the end, but again, if anyone's got any questions, I'm more than happy to follow up with you. Here is my email address if there's anything you want to send to me directly. But if you've got any questions now, I'm more than happy to answer them. Well, basically what an MG or an MRG or a minimum revenue guarantee, it's all terms for the same thing. Generally what that is you making a commitment or a contractual promise to pay a minimum amount of revenue or a minimum amount of usage. So you might say that you'll project that you'll have 500,000 in revenue. That'll be written into the contract. If, in effect, you actually only have 200,000 of revenue, at the end of the term, you still need to pay over that 300,000, whether or not you've actually used it. So it's just something to be aware of, and that's why your projections have to be spot on, and they have to be correct. So, but again, you've got to if you go in and say, oh, well, I'm going to have 2 subscribers a month, they're not going to be interested and you're not going to get a deal. So you've got to be realistic and get a deal done, but you've got to make sure people are interested and you've got a good proposition. Thanks.